This is simultaneously the weirdest and the scariest thing that ever happened to me, and it happened to me when I was a kid. For backstory, my dad has worked for a major building materials supply company for over 30 years, and he's one of the higher-ups. Even though he's reached retirement age, my sister and I know that he won't quit until he absolutely has to. That's just who our dad is. He's one of the hardest working, but also nicest people that you'd ever want to meet. When the events of this story took place, he had just gotten a major promotion and was being transferred to one of the company's locations in Michigan. I'm pretty sure he had some say in where he was transferred, because this was relatively close to his hometown and he knew a few people in the area. In fact, one of the people he went to school with, who I think was one of his childhood friends, was a realtor in the area. Incidentally, as we need to pick out a new house, she was excited to show us around, and that would give her and my dad an opportunity to catch up. Also, by us, I mean just me and my dad, as my mom was 8 months pregnant with my sister Caitlin at the time, and so didn't feel safe riding on a plane. Instead, my mom stayed with my aunt and uncle while my dad and I were in Michigan. We planned to be there for 3 days, partly to pick out a house, but also because my dad was going to start meeting people who worked at the local warehouse and factory center and take a tour of the facilities. I'd ridden a plane once before on a trip to see family, but I was still fascinated with the experience the second time around. I think we were on a relatively smaller plane, though not like a private jet or anything, and the airport where we landed was very small. I'm pretty sure there was just one terminal and only a few different gates. As we got off the plane, I ran through the little boarding walkway and my dad had to yell for me to stay with him. A few minutes later we came out into the main lobby, which had this fountain in the center and wood paneling covering most of the walls. Overall I'd say it was about the size of 2 tennis courts, and it wasn't very busy. My dad looked around to find the rental car place while I sat on one of the benches and looked behind me at the fountain. And I think that's where the nightmare that played out in the background of our trip began. There was a man near the exit on the other side of the lobby, just standing there, but when I looked in his direction, he immediately made eye contact and smiled. Or at least, I think he made eye contact. He was wearing these big sunglasses, like the kind after you have an eye operation, and he had long hair. The guy looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, a little older than my dad, and he was wearing a red and white striped collared shirt and khaki shorts with a belt. I found the fact he returned my gaze a little amusing, but didn't really dwell on it. I looked back at my dad, who found the kiosk he needed and was now talking to some guy behind the counter. Then I looked around the room at the wood paneling and some of the light fixtures. Maybe a minute later I randomly looked back in the man's direction, and again he smiled immediately when I saw him. That I found odd. I started to think he was someone from my dad's company, though why he wasn't coming over I wasn't sure. I went up to my dad and asked if someone was picking us up. My dad looked down at me and told me no, but that the company was paying for our entire visit, including a rental car, and the employee was going to get him the keys and lead us out. I was about to point the man out and ask my dad if he knew him, but when I looked back in his direction, this time he was gone. I scanned my surroundings and didn't see him anywhere. Well, I guess that was that. A second later, the employee came back to the counter and handed my dad the keys and greeted me. He led us to the rental car lot and we got in our rental, which was legit a BMW. I think my dad planned for us to check in at the hotel first, but by this time it was the early afternoon and I'd already gone through the snacks we'd brought. I was pretty hungry, so instead we stopped at a McDonald's and went to a nearby park while my dad called his realtor friend. After spending time at the park, we got back in the car and drove for half an hour until we got to this really upscale neighborhood that was still under construction. Now, my dad was very frugal, so even if we could have afforded to live in a place like this, we wouldn't have moved in. I think his friend just wanted to show off the area, and I suspect he thought I'd get a kick out of seeing huge mansion-like houses. It looked like this was going to be a gated community, with a fence being put up all around, but it wasn't anywhere near complete, and there wasn't anything stopping people from driving in or out of the neighborhood. The entrance did have these 2 pillars with a beam across them, kind of like an ancient Greek or Roman building, which I guess was supposed to show how fancy this place was. It was a cool sight, especially with a blue sky and white puffy clouds above it. We drove through this gently winding road that at first had concrete slabs on either side, then had houses with just wooden frames, and finally houses that were seemingly finished. There were only like 5 houses that were completely built, all in this one cul-de-sac, and there was a car parked in front of one of them. As my dad and I slowed down, a lady got out of the car and waved to us, and my dad rolled down the window and greeted her. We parked behind her and then got out, and as we started walking in her direction, she bent down and exclaimed, "You must be Josh." Normally I was shy around strangers, but maybe because she was a family friend or seemed really friendly, I answered yes and kept walking forward. She walked over and hugged my dad, and he introduced her as Miss Jill. As I got caught up, we made our way up the driveway and then the front walkway and porch. This house, like the others around it, had this very pretty red brick exterior, and the porch wrapped around almost to the side yard. The front door had these very elaborate glass panels in it and other windows surrounding it. In fact, it seemed like almost the entire front of the house was covered in windows. Miss Jill, or I'll just call her Jill, opened the front door and my dad and I walked inside. Though there was a little foyer area, it led directly into the family room, which was massive. This seemed to be a 2-story house, and it looked like the room went all the way to the roof. The room had 2 couches and a big screen TV, and as this story took place in ancient times, it was a legit big CRT TV and not a flat screen. While the foyer had tile, the family room had carpeting. Though my dad was about to stop me from wandering on it, Jill assured him it was fine. The far end of the room led to the patio in the back, and on the left side there was this massive brick fireplace. I'll skip over some details, but at one point we went to the upstairs, which had the master bedroom and bathroom along with several other rooms. One of them was set up as an office with a computer, and I immediately got intrigued. Before my dad could stop me, I tried turning it on, and then realized it wasn't even plugged in. Jill laughed and said it wasn't hooked up, and I immediately offered to help her. My dad shook his head, but Jill did thank me for the offer. I noticed one of the cables led to the closet, and upon opening the door, I saw like 10 pieces of equipment set up on wire racks, which I was pretty sure were supposed to be used for clothes. Some of them looked like printers or VCRs, and I assumed they were part of the office-type mock-up. Either that or the real estate company was using this room to store equipment they weren't using. Eventually we finished the tour, and my dad hinted that we needed to check into the hotel room before it got too late. He and Jill said their goodbyes, and we got back in our car, but not before I noticed another car parked 2 houses down in that same cul-de-sac. It had blue-green paint, and I think it was a Ford Escape. A minute later, as the houses were almost out of view, I noticed the cars started moving. I didn't think anything of it at the time, maybe since I was a little tired and starting to get hungry, but in hindsight it was definitely strange. Even if that was a realtor or a prospective homebuyer, where was the person they were meeting? We also didn't spend a super lot of time inside the house, so that person apparently just got there and then left. Anyway, 10 minutes later we got to the hotel, which had like 10 stories but was also in a newly developing region that was surrounded by cornfields. The lobby was pretty fancy and had couches with bright red upholstery. After checking in, we took an elevator to our room, which was on the 3rd floor. My dad and I each had our own bed, and I jumped back and forth between them as he set down our things. Now it was around 5:30, and both me and my dad were getting hungry. We left the hotel and drove around a bit, both to pick out a restaurant and to enjoy the sunset. Eventually we settled on this pizza place which had a big oversized cartoon statue of a pizza maker at the front. It wasn't crowded when we got inside, and we got our pizza pretty quickly. One of the things that set this restaurant apart was a literal pizza room they had. No, it wasn't actually made of pizza, but most of the floor and walls were painted yellow, along with huge red polka dots which represented pepperoni. I'm pretty sure this room and the statue out front were meant to appeal to kids, and it worked, because my dad and I ate our pizza at one of the tables in this room. Very sadly, I can't remember the name of this place. Years later when I went back and tried to find it, I'm pretty sure I found the same building, only it was another business. Once we were done eating, my dad and I got back in the rental car and headed back to the hotel. By this time, I was getting really excited to try out the pool, and after quickly changing into our swimming trunks, I ran back down the hallway and stairs, not wanting to wait for the elevator. Instead of yelling for me to stop, my dad actually raced me, though he did caution me to slow down at points so as to avoid running into people. When we finally got downstairs and into the pool room, we were both taken aback at how impressive the structure was. Though you couldn't see it from the door leading in from the hallway, there was actually a mezzanine of sorts, with more of those plastic pool chairs and tables on it. Coupled with the pillars that rose up directly from within the pool, this place was fancy. But it was only when we walked out from under the mezzanine and looked up that we saw bright lights shining up on the sky and clouds that had been painted on the ceiling. Apparently my dad's company had spared no expense with our trip. After taking in the sight for a moment, I ran and did a cannonball and my dad started laughing and jumped in the pool too. I'll skip over most of the second day, since a lot of it involved me playing on my Game Boy Advance in a break room while my dad had meetings. I do want to mention that this warehouse my dad would be working at was huge. It even seemed like there was fog in there, though maybe that was just due to the lighting. There's also this mock-up of a house designed to showcase the various building materials, but sadly you couldn't walk inside. On the third and final day, we checked out of our hotel room after eating the complimentary breakfast at 9 a.m. I remember my dad was in a really good mood, likely because the meetings the day before went well and he finished everything he needed to. Therefore, we could just have fun seeing a few more houses with Jill. Our flight wasn't until like 8, so we literally had the whole day. After driving for around 15 minutes, we met Jill outside of another house. Unlike the previous one, this house was actually in a completed neighborhood. As we drove over, we saw a few people doing yard work and going for walks. These houses weren't nearly as big as the first one, but still, this area was relatively upscale. Almost every house was 2 stories and had big plots of land around it. The interior of the house we saw there was really nice as well, though details aren't relevant to the story. However, as we were leaving, I saw a strangely familiar car drive up. It took me a few moments to realize it was that same blue-green Ford Escape that parked near us at the house we saw 2 days ago. This time it didn't stop, but instead drove slowly by. I don't think Jill or my dad noticed, and I tried to look inside, but the windows were too tinted. Still, I got the distinct feeling that whoever was in there was looking at us, specifically me. As my dad and I got back in our car to follow Jill over to the next house, I mentioned to him that it was the same car as before. I don't think I expressed myself clearly though, and my dad didn't seem concerned. My dad followed Jill to another neighborhood that was about 15 minutes away, and the whole time I kept looking around, trying to find that car. I couldn't though. The next neighborhood was similar to the one we just visited, and the house was very impressive as well. This one had a game room with a foosball machine, and my dad and even Jill and I played a few rounds. While we played, my dad asked Jill for recommendations on how to spend the rest of the day, since it wasn't even lunchtime yet and we only had one more house to see. Jill insisted that we visit her house, but for some reason my dad didn't want to. I vaguely remember that Jill lived with and helped take care of a sick family member, and I don't think my dad wanted to impose. Anyway, we finally finished touring that house, and my dad and Jill decided to break for lunch and so she could check in with another client. I'd almost put the car out of my mind again, but just as we were leaving, it appeared around a corner and drove slowly towards us. Now, I was kind of freaking out, especially when the car slowed down even more. The passenger side window was lowered a few inches, but I still couldn't get a good look inside. I quickly blurted out, "It's the same car," and Jill and my dad stopped mid-sentence and looked. Right when they looked, the car sped up. As it disappeared down the block, my dad and Jill exchanged glances, and I could tell both of them were now worried. My dad asked for more information, and this time I was able to convey that the same car had parked outside while we were touring the first house on the first day, and I saw it leave after we left as well. My dad asked Jill if that was anyone she knew, and she shook her head. Equally unsettling was the question of how that person was able to follow us. My dad swore it was no one from his company, and Jill swore it wasn't anyone from her real estate company or a prospective buyer. None of us had a good explanation. Maybe because of that, we all had some doubt. I also hadn't gotten the license plate number, and I was 7 years old after all. A few minutes passed, and my dad and Jill came to the agreement that if we saw that car again, we'd contact the police. In the meantime, he checked with the people at his office, and Jill would call her boss and one of her clients. I got in the car with my dad and we started driving. He deliberately drove in a roundabout way before parking at the warehouse. All the while we were scanning our surroundings. My dad kept me with him as he spoke to a few of the people there, all of whom seemed completely unaware of the situation. Finally, when there was like no one else to talk to, we got back in the car. My dad and I just sat there for a minute, trying to think. My dad ended up calling Jill back, and 30 seconds into the phone call, he started to sound relieved and even began laughing. Apparently one of Jill's clients had been trying to get in touch with her, but had written down her number wrong. So it seemed like that was the most likely explanation, and my dad joked around that her client should have just stopped and said hi and spared us the worry. Now with that weight off our shoulders, my dad and I drove over and ate at another fast food place, then began driving to our final house. It was like 4 in the afternoon at this point, and we'd probably head straight for the airport after we were done. This time we drove into this wooded area, and the houses were even more spread out. Most of the houses didn't look as new, and they were single stories, but some had apparently undergone renovations and were massive mini mansions. After navigating for a few minutes, we found Jill's car and parked behind her at one of these mansion-type houses. As they got out of their respective cars, Jill and my dad started laughing. We walked to the front porch and Jill let us in. The foyer in this house wasn't connected to any of the rooms, but instead had hallways leading off into 3 different directions. We went down the middle hallway, which brought us to the family room. The people who lived here had a very fancy wooden table and cabinets filled with china. The lighting was also rather dim, but gave off a cozy type feeling. This house was truly massive, with one room or hallway leading into another room, and it felt like we were inside of a maze. Right when I thought we were done, Jill told us she had saved the best for last, and asked if I wanted to see the indoor underground pool room. Of course I was down, and Jill and my dad started laughing as I excitedly motioned for them to lead the way. This next part I remember vividly. There was a narrow staircase, which seemed really out of place for a house. It was carpeted as well. It led down to a distinctive wooden door with glass panels, and upon opening it, I was greeted with a rather impressive sight. There was a decently sized pool, almost like one you'd find in a regular hotel, and it had fake rocks around the boundary, and one side even had a waterfall. There were also plants and planters like you'd find in a mall, and the air was pleasantly humid and warm. All of a sudden I realized I didn't have my swimsuit, but before I could ask to get it, my dad handed it to me. He and Jill must have been planning this as a surprise for me for the end of the trip. I didn't know where to change, but Jill pointed to a door on another side of the room. I ran over as my dad yelled at me not to run, and I quickly opened the door that led to a spacious bathroom that even had its own jacuzzi. I guess these people really went all out, and in that moment I was extremely glad they let prospective buyers try out the pool. However, this is where things changed in the worst way imaginable. I remember I had just hooked my thumbs inside my underwear and shorts to pull them off when I thought I heard a sound coming from the jacuzzi. The tub wasn't full of water, so I hadn't expected it to make any sound, and it almost sounded like someone's shoe slipping on the plastic. But before I could even react, and in a scene that is etched into my retinas, I saw a stranger wearing all black jump up out of the tub and lunge right at me. The guy managed to get one arm around my waist and the other around my mouth, but not before I screamed like there was no tomorrow. Not 3 seconds later, the door flew open and my dad was screaming and punching the man. Thank God he appeared to give up right away, but he was able to make it past my dad and through the door. Then we heard Jill scream. After that, my dad picked me up and carried me back to the pool room. We found Jill in tears, pressed against the wall and pointing towards the exit. At first I assumed we were going to follow him, but my dad actually motioned for Jill to come with us back into the bathroom. She came, and when we were inside, my dad checked the room, then barricaded the door and called 911. I can't tell you how it felt to wait there in a stranger's house, in the room you were almost abducted in no less, listening to someone crying in fear and praying for the police to get there. Even now this doesn't seem real, but it was. The police did arrive 10 minutes later, and we were still safe when they found us. Me, my dad, and Jill explained what happened, and that was the start of a big investigation. My dad and I didn't take our flight back that day, rather, we ended up leaving the next day. Thankfully, the police arranged for us to stay at another hotel with surveillance. My mom was hysterical when my dad called her, and I still remember that phone call as being one of the most emotional of my entire life. I'm pretty sure my dad was afraid it would send her into premature labor, but thank God that didn't happen. One thing we found out soon after the police arrived was that Jill's client had not been the person in the blue-green Ford Escape. I'm not sure of the specifics, but there must have been some kind of miscommunication on her part, and I'm sure she felt horrible. As far as we could tell, none of the people whose homes we visited had any part in what happened. That includes the elderly couple that owned the house with the pool, who had no idea who that man was, or why or when he broke into their house. But here's where things get even more unclear. While being questioned by police, I remember the man who was apparently watching me in the airport, but I was like 95% sure it was a different person from the guy in the jacuzzi. I don't think they ever found a solid link between each of those 2 men and the car following us either. In my mind, they had to be connected, but there was no proof. That also brought up the unpleasant question of what exactly their goal was. Even after analyzing everything we said, the police weren't sure if the man in the jacuzzi was actually trying to abduct me, or if he was just planning to rob the house, but then had to deal with me when I entered the room. But like I said, I feel like all these events were connected, which makes it seem like they were trying to get me, specifically. My dad, who I wouldn't label as a conspiracy theorist, but was obviously very concerned I almost got abducted, pressured some of the people in his company for details. As far as I know, my dad's company was never involved in anything shady, like mob stuff, and they cooperated fully with the investigation. but my dad just wanted to make sure I hadn't been targeted for any reason. Also, I don't think there was ever any bad blood between my dad and any of his coworkers, such as for him getting a promotion. He seems to be a well-respected member of the company. But then you never know what crazy person might take offense to something someone said, or hold a grudge. Ultimately, nothing ever came of the investigation. We actually did end up moving to Michigan, and my dad worked as the manager at that warehouse, but we obviously didn't move in any of those houses we visited. Instead, my mom and dad picked a much more modest house in the suburbs, which is what I figured they were going to do anyway. I remember my mom being much more fearful after this whole ordeal, and always wanting me to come straight home after school, and I really don't blame her. My parents also made me and my sister take self-defense and karate classes, and my dad taught us other ways to defend ourselves in specific scenarios. Thankfully, we've never had to use that training at any point in our lives, which have been good since then. Still, I can't help thinking back on this experience, usually daily. There are so many unanswered questions, and it does terrify me a bit that whoever those people were, whether they were working together or not, were never identified. I just hope that I never run into any of them again.